All right, we are live. Hello, everybody. This is Jeanette Bruce coming to you live from Alpine. I am the program coordinator at Whistler Public Library, and I am delighted to be your host tonight for this session of Litminds. And of course, Litminds is presented in partnership with a couple of great organizations, our friends at the Youth Center, the Whistler Youth Center, and our friends at Luna Whistler. The three of our organizations present this series together, and we've also got, we've had some really wonderful sponsors for this series. Currently, this chapter of the series is being sponsored by the Whistler RCMP, and we also want to thank Vancouver Coastal Health for their support tonight. Now, before I dive into telling you who's here to talk to us tonight, I just want to remind folks that the next session of Litminds is not next Tuesday, but it's the Tuesday after, so that's August 4th, and we will be speaking to Dr. Teresa Wood, who is a local general practitioner here in Whistler, and she is an absolute delight, so you'll want to join us on August 4th. Please mark your calendars. And as for tonight's session, I will remind you that you can ask us questions as this session is going on. You have two options. You can use Slido, and the link for Slido is in the YouTube chat, or you can just type your questions right there in the YouTube chat box. Keep in mind that on YouTube, your questions are not anonymous, but on Slido, they can be totally anonymous. So we will be monitoring those chat feeds, and if you have any questions, please share them there. Now, tonight we have a guest with us. Laurel Ward is a peer support worker for Vancouver Coastal Health, and she helps her clients and groups by sharing her lived experience with concussion recovery, anxiety management, and supporting family members with mental health navigation. And I do believe that we are going to be hearing about some of that lived experience tonight. And so Laurel will be in conversation with our regular speaker, registered clinical counselor, Dr. Greg McDonnell. And so I think I will throw it over to Laurel and let her take it away. Oh, sorry, Greg. Not a doctor. My bad. I just, trust his judgment so much. All right, I am going to throw it over to our speakers. We've got Laurel and we've got Greg, and I will be back in a little bit to ask questions from the audience. Take it away, guys.
Thank you, Jeanette. Really appreciate that introduction. Laurel, thank you very much for joining us tonight on Litminds.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah. I also wanted to add that we are coming to you tonight from the unceded territories of the Squamish and Lil'wat nations, and really thrilled to have Laurel here with us tonight, which we intend to really have an in-depth and far-reaching conversation about finding purpose and identity and connecting with community through a couple of really amazing contexts that I'm sure everyone listening can relate to. So Laurel, as we welcome you to Litminds, could you start by telling us a little bit about you?
Sure. Hi, everybody. I am Laurel, and I'm working as a peer support worker for Vancouver Coastal Health. My job in that is that I work within the mental health care team, and I help to support clients and also some groups by sharing my unique lived experience. So tonight I will be sharing some of my experiences with you all in the context that Greg said of purpose, identity, and community. So I'd say the best place to start would be about 4 and a bit years ago when I had a really life-changing incident. I got my first concussion when I was in a workplace, in the wrong place, wrong time kind of situation. And I ended up going through an immense amount of grief from the loss of my purpose and my identity and my community through that. And now I'm in the late recovery of my 5th concussion, which I'm grateful to have a chuckle at, because it has been quite the journey to get through. But I have gained a lot of experience through that. That's been very valuable. So although it's been a really challenging journey for me, and I have had a lot of significant lows, the recovery process and a lot of other difficult experiences that I've had in my life have ended up directing me to this purpose that is genuinely fulfilling for me, to be a part of a mental health care team.
Amazing.
So,
That's
yeah.
amazing. And you know, I might just add, Laurel, that really mirrors something I've been talking about a lot with clients or on this forum. And that's a very predictable, though very chaotic pathway with chaos of sort of birth, rise to a plateau of awesomeness, but then actually quite a predictable crash, burn, fiery, dramatic chaos. But what tends to follow that 100% of the times is this rebirth, hey?
Yeah, absolutely. I've definitely felt a sense of rebirth multiple times on this journey, for sure.
Awesome. And I suspect you will again in life, because that's part of maybe the human condition I think that we're all faced with, is this rebuild phase, this picking ourselves back up, this rolling our sleeves up and leaning into it, you know?
Yeah, absolutely. I like to think as recovery, the fulfillment of recovery isn't getting to that destination at the end. It's all the work that you do along the way that really makes it what it is.
So not the outcome, more the process, hey?
Exactly. And it is a lot of process. So once you get to the end, you know that that's where it is. And ultimately it doesn't really end because especially in my case, every end has had a new beginning of another injury for my concussions in particular. And yeah, it's been an experience for sure. Each one gets a little bit easier to understand, and it's been really interesting to see the differences, but also the similarities between them, and to explore those in conversation with other people, because concussions can be so different person to person.
And that would have taken just a ton of courage. Tell us about your journey of taking those personal experiences of those concussions to the peer support group.
Sure. So, well, I was going to start with my identity in general. And if you had asked me about 5 years ago what my identity was, I would not have told you I was on this path to peer support work. I would have told you that I was a tree planter. And I was working on a career plan to remain in that industry. I had worked up pretty quickly over 5 years, and I had been offered a position to co-manage a camp. And in the second year that I was going to do my management year, I was really excited. I had all these improvements that I wanted to make for my first big learning curve of management. A month before going, I got my first concussion. And it was really difficult for me to understand what that meant, that this concussion wasn't just what I thought was a simple knock to the head and the traditional, oh yeah, you just take some rest and you'll be okay as long as you don't fall asleep, you know, the very old ways of thinking of healing a concussion. Being in a dark room for a couple of weeks and then coming out and being fine and you're back in your sports or school or whatever you're used to doing. For me, I really, really struggled because I kept pushing myself. And the key to concussion is to find the balance and the pace.
Do you find, Laurel, that you kept pushing yourself because you were perhaps responding to what you thought those around you expected your identity to be?
I really did feel like I was letting down my tree planting community. I was already in the process of hiring employees, And I had been, it's a bit of a family situation. So I was anti-Laurel in my first year of being a co-manager. And I really did want to be there for the team that I was supposed to work with. So yes, I definitely felt like I was letting them down and I was letting myself down. I just really had a hard time letting it go. And
And I
the
think,
interesting thing about tree planting in particular is that it is such a unique social community and you're so strongly bonded because you are out in the bush and you're in this environment where you work and you live together. So it was, yeah, it's very hard to be removed from that community and to accept that that wasn't going to be my fate that summer and evidently not my fate in the likely future.
interesting. Interesting. Yeah. Like, and with tree planting, having done it myself, I realized that you all sort of are surviving something out there. You know, the arduous work, the long work hours, the bugs, the travel, the whatever, 13 cents per tree. You know, you have to really work hard to turn a buck. And so when you perhaps develop those family bonds, they're kind of like survivor bonds or maybe even trauma bonds. But the other observation I was going to make is sometimes with you didn't want to let your family down. When external forces are controlling that identity, it kind of makes us powerless a little bit, I do believe. And so, so yeah, again, I'm really interested in this journey of you getting that power back for yourself.
Yeah, for sure. So with that first recovery, it was a really big struggle. In the first 2 months, I pushed myself so hard. And unfortunately, I didn't have great advice as well, medical advice. I wasn't working with an experienced doctor at the time. And I didn't have the right resources. I was also on workers' comp. And so I was feeling a lot of pressure to get back to work as soon as possible and to follow this linear trajectory that most injuries do have when it comes to workers' comp. However, concussions are not in the slightest bit linear, especially when you don't know what your balance is. And so after 2 months, I had a very massive relapse. And it was to the point where I was in a state of complete shock. One morning, I had pushed myself so hard. I didn't have this homeostasis in my body. I was going through these really intense hot to cold flashes. And my partner at the time found me in hysterics, I have to be honest. And he drove me down to the emergency in Whistler. I'm currently located in Pemberton. And when I went down to Whistler, I found a whole new world of concussion experience and medical help because, of course, there are so many concussion patients that end up in emerge. So they questioned a lot of what I had been doing at the time to get myself to that state after 2 months. And I then ended up with some really great resources and an occupational therapist who was completely changing in my trajectory through that recovery in particular.
Amazing. Awesome. And then from there, what did your purpose become? It must have shifted towards like the purpose of healing.
Yeah, so one of the things that really helped me was to accept that healing was my full-time job. Recovery was my full-time job. And when I was able to accept that, which more so actually came in my my third concussion. My second one was just a re-concussion in between my first and third. And my third one was quite major in a car accident. And at that point, I started to take recovery very seriously. But I also, after the car accident, had a very different experience from the first one. With the first one being workplace accident, wrong place, wrong time, in a workplace that I didn't think was the safest place to be all the time. It was very frustrating, especially in dealing with workers' comp and being pushed and having medical help that wasn't actually helping me, and all the pressures of trying to get better in the wrong kind of way. In the third concussion, I had this car accident, and I hit a patch of black ice. I was actually driving to a physical rehab program for re-injury to my neck and my shoulder, ironically. And I hit a patch of black ice on the first snow day a few years ago, and I rolled about 15 feet into a ditch in a small SUV, a fairly old one, my little tracker. But she did save my life, and I walked away from that being immensely grateful. I had so much gratitude for the first little while. And even when I was quite down and I was struggling, I'd always come back to this sense of gratitude, because I lived through something that I could have very easily not have lived through if it didn't go the way exactly that it did. And I could walk and I could talk, and I would eventually make a pretty full recovery back to the same physical self, I'd say, with some minor adjustments and a more reasonable energy level than I had when I was tree planting. But a completely different purpose and identity and community at the end of it all.
How did the community shift?
So the community shifted in a few ways. At the time, I had a partner who had supported me, but unfortunately, the relationship wasn't exactly what was working for both of us. And so at a certain point after the car accident and I was further along recovered, he did end the relationship. And so I did experience a loss at that time of my main support through recovery, as well as his network of friends, because one thing that's probably well known with concussions is that it's very hard to have social interactions. So I was relearning my social interactions with his group of friends, and I wasn't generally going out and making my own new friends. And I also was removed from my tree planting community, which is quite scattered across the country. And although I did definitely have key friends that I talked to on the phone regularly, it just wasn't the same sort of community. And then I also found a stronger bond with my family through that experience. My sister and I ended up having some very similarly parallel experiences. She has struggled with mental health for the majority of her life as well. And my mom had had a number of car accidents when I was younger too. And I didn't quite understand what it meant for her to have gone through those. She had 3 and none of them were her fault. They were all people running red lights, and they were 3 recoveries on a similar sort of back-to-back as what I ended up experiencing. And so I really came to appreciate what she had gone through in supporting 2 teenage daughters, and one of them had mental health problems that at that time weren't diagnosed, and she was also working full time. Yeah, it was a great bonding experience with family for sure.
Oh, that's amazing. Yeah, I think as we go through these different stages of life, these different people come in and out and back in again sometimes. And it seems like that they were a core piece of also not only the community, but also choosing, okay, what's my identity going to be now that I'm committing to the healing journey, and maybe not going back to tree planting. It seems like they're a big part of that.
Yeah, definitely. They're a big part. And I am so fortunate to have a loving and supportive family and two parents that are still together. I think they've been together for, 40 or 50 years now. And just very loving and supportive. Traditionally growing up, we were kind of expected to follow this traditional trajectory of going to school and, you know, finding someone and settling down and having a career and all of that. But when my sister's problems came to light and my parents came to support her through that more and more, we came to all realize that this traditional trajectory doesn't necessarily work for everyone and that that's okay. Life will go on and we'll find a way to work through it and to have our connection and to find fulfillment in other ways. And another way in which my life did not follow that traditional trajectory a while ago too was that I actually identify as being pansexual. So for anyone who's not familiar with that term, it's similar to being bisexual, except that it just means that you're attracted to all genders. So you don't necessarily state the male and female, but I personally believe in a gender spectrum, so that you can be on maybe a bit more of a masculine feminine side or a bit more feminine masculine side, and it's that sliding scale. And just accepting that and appreciating that. So a while ago, I had been in my first queer relationship, and I was navigating that with my family as well. And I was so fortunate to have and the love and support from them through that. Although there was a little bit of challenge with the traditional ways. At the time, my mom had a friend who, her family, she was the aunt of someone who was going through this similar experience of coming out to their family and not being accepted. And my mom supporting this friend and their niece, she came to realize that she didn't want to do that to me, that she wanted to be there and love me and support me no matter what. And she was able to just let go of any bias. And it was so wonderful to have that, because it was something that I was nervous about for quite a while. And it took me a long time to come out.
Well, that's a lovely story, and one that would have taken just a ton of vulnerability. But I think turning toward the vulnerability, this is language we know now, thanks to the work of Brene Brown, but turning towards that vulnerability is kind of where the magic happens. Now, all of a sudden, this is post-concussion stuff, and now identity structure is starting to get firmly planted. You know?
Yeah, absolutely. So I was really coming into myself and just living my life and being who I am, and trying to figure out who that was and how that was changing with so much volatility in my life and this new vulnerability that I did have with being concussed. Because another thing about concussions is that once you get one, it's so easy to get another one, as I can attest to being on my fifth now. The last two were a month apart, back to back. The second one that I had there was just simply because my spatial awareness was off, from the one that I had just had before, and it definitely compounded and turned it into a much more extreme concussion experience than what it was for the first month there.
Yeah, I'll bet. So now you're out, you're feeling really well supported by your family and connected to your family members, your sister included. And, perhaps grieving the loss of this old life and this old community. Tell us about the rebirth after that.
So I'd say probably one of the beginnings of that rebirth was when I was in the recovery after my car accident, and I was really struggling with this sense of grief and so much loss. I didn't know how to process grief. I've experienced anxiety, and I know how to manage anxiety, and I've helped family and friends through depression and other things, but grief was just this great big thing, and there was so many things for me to grieve, with so many losses all at once. I didn't know how to handle it. And another thing that I in particular struggle with concussion is obsessive thoughts. When I'm acutely concussed, I can get these really persistent thoughts, and if I have things that I'm passionate about or that are bothering me, I just can't let them go. And at the time, I was processing this queer relationship that I had been in. So for the first 2 years, we were in a queer relationship, but then 2 years into it, my partner had come out as being somewhere on the transgender spectrum, androgynous transgender. It was early exploration days. And we were together for another 2 years through that. And it was a really incredible experience. I connected very strongly with the community through that, and I found a lot of strength in my identity with that. But unfortunately, that partner was struggling with their own mental health crisis, and I struggled myself with boundaries, and I was overextending to support them through it. And then we ended up falling into this pattern of it being a controlling and emotionally abusive relationship. And I really started to lose myself. And I had just escaped that when I had come out to Pemberton, and I'd only been here for a few months when I had my first concussion. So I had gone to this place where I was just looking for respite for the off season to kind of recover from this relationship and just have my downtime. And then I wanted to go back into tree planting and claim my identity as my own person. But then I had the concussion. And so I really struggled with all of this and processing this. And that ended up sending me into counseling. It's something that I had done before when I was in university. I got counseling mostly for anxiety management. And when I was with that previous partner in the queer relationship, we did partner counseling to try to work through the queer identity and gender spectrum challenges that we were facing and how that was going to work. And so I discovered that Vancouver Coastal Health had counseling offered, and if you can't afford counseling, they can get you some sessions for free that are covered on your Canadian health plan. And so I ended up hooking up with a counselor through them, and I worked through so much that I had to process. And I am still working through a lot that I've had to process.
But I just want to add, but hallelujah, because it's through that processing that enables you to get to the place of acceptance around some of these grief and loss pieces, right? And
yes,
so finally
absolutely.
you had someone on the journey to help you with that.
The key I found, yes, for sure, with dealing with grief is that you have to sit with it. Mm-hmm. You just have to sit with it. You have to feel it. You have to process it. The more you avoid it and just try to distract yourself from it, it doesn't go away. And in fact, for me, it was physically manifesting in my body. And with all of the injuries that I was trying to recover from, it was really holding me back from my recovery. I've actually had moments in my sessions where I've been talking about something really emotional and I've been working through it and had these revelations, and I can feel this physical tension in my neck going up through my head and just ballooning, and then it just releases. And it's quite amazing what that can do, but you just have to process the grief to get through it. And that was something I couldn't do on my own.
And yeah, I agree with you completely. You have to kind of bear witness and be with the grief to get to that place. Laurel, do you, you mentioned sort of denying the processing of that grief and loss. Do you recall ways in which you, you know, the ways that you denied or numbed away from processing that stuff?
Yes, I sure do. So for me, my go-to was that I would smoke weed. I have struggled with that for a few years of my life. It's been a great way to relax and unwind, but also to just completely shut off and to not deal with the things that I've had to deal with.
Of course, we live in a corridor here where there's such a culture of acceptance of that, right? So it's probably normalized.
Yeah, absolutely. It's very normalized. And for me, I say to each their own. For some people, it works for them and it helps with pain and it helps them get through things. But my personal experience was that it was really starting to interfere with my ability to process. And I was just using it to shut off entirely, and to not feel things and to not accept and sit with this grief and these other emotions that I had to work through. So in the process of counseling, that was one of the things that I started to tackle. And that was a huge step for me to take because many years ago, the very first time that I had taken counseling and I was dealing with anxiety in university, the first counselor I had ever seen had blamed everything that I was dealing with on the fact that I smoked weed. So I shut down, I got a different counselor, and I never spoke to another counselor about that again until probably 2 years ago or so now, I guess it would be. And through that time, I have been working with my counselor to kind of understand my patterns and pick it apart and to accept it for what it is for me, which is a dependency or an addiction. And then at one point, I was talking to my counselor about wanting to become a counselor in the future and what that trajectory might look like. And she had told me about the peer support worker program, which I was very fortunate enough to be able to attend last fall in Pemberton. But just before it started, I decided that it was really important for me to not have this dependency and not to struggle with that anymore. And I decided now is the time to get very serious about letting this go. So I did quit at that time. I'd already been close to quitting anyways, but I quit cold turkey at that time. And for a while, it was really easy to hate it and to want nothing to do with it, and to feel very removed from it and to feel really good without it. But then at a certain point, it became legalized, and then summer happened and it's everywhere and you can smell it everywhere, and the triggers started to come. So I actually have been working with Smart Recovery and attending some of their meetings. And I'm now looking at doing their facilitator training, which is a program that you can do online. And I've been finding some really great tools and resources to manage through them. And it's been a great experience. But it is a lot about just breaking those old habits and sitting with the anxiety and the cravings and just accepting them for what they are so that you can build these new pathways in your brain where going to weed or whatever your distraction of choice is not the answer anymore, where you sit with it, you sit in that discomfort, and damn, it's so uncomfortable sometimes, but you always get through it. And having that support with that community through the Smart Recovery meetings has been really helpful.
Amazing. Laurel, I'm really interested in the character traits in you a couple of times. Once with the concussion recovery, you said your language was you got really serious about the recovery journey. And then as you said, use the same language with respect to your, pot use. It was, I decided before I enter this peer support group, I'm going to become really serious about this. And I'm just really interested in the character traits in you and that it took for you to become really serious about those things. Oftentimes when I'm working with injured workers through WorkSafe, with my clients, I have a little bit of a chuckle sometimes, and I say to them, okay, now you're like a pro sports athlete and you're kind of paid to work out. So, because you're supported through WorkSafe, and so you got to go to this occupational rehab program, and you got to do the weights, and that you have an actual like fitness professional helping you with a specific exercise. You're actually paid for that. You're like a pro, and some people get that inner desire to get the burn and do the work, and then other people have a really hard time with that. For you, what did it really take for you to become really serious about those changes?
I think one of the things that I began to work on was the decision to invest in myself. I've always been someone who puts others before myself. I call myself an overly considerate person. I will make myself uncomfortable to make other people comfortable. And that's what makes me feel, or used to make me feel good. But through my recovery process, I didn't have that option anymore because it would sacrifice my ability to get better, which would ultimately sacrifice my ability to help people in the future. So I came to this understanding that I really just needed to invest in me. And I've had this theory that I called the cake theory when I was looking at training tree planters. And the cake theory was a way to describe the different training layers, but every good cake starts with a solid foundation. You have the plate that you have to put it on, and that plate is your self-care. And if you don't have that solid plate, it doesn't matter what kind of extravagantly beautiful cake of all the different layers that you can make. If you don't have a plate to hold it on, it's going to fall apart. And instead of just telling this to other people, I came to accept it in myself, which was life-changing.
Amazing. That is just beautiful and inspiring, and just riffing off your language from, invest in me. That was the skill set. And I really want to highlight that for people. Take me to the place where you started investing in this idea of who you're going to be next. This curiosity about being a counselor yourself.
Yeah, so I'd say that came out of my first concussion. That's when I started to really identify with this idea of becoming a counselor. My sister was going through her mental health crisis, and I was seeing these parallels, and I was working with her to try to help her. I had come to this place where we were really estranged when we were younger, because of what she was going through. And I was the annoying younger sister that would always irritate her. And she was already quite agitated because of her mental health condition. And she just didn't want anything to do with me. And I thought she hated me. And then as we kind of grew closer together, and I kind of came to understand that life isn't necessarily that fair, and there's not this linear trajectory anymore. And we started to talk more and more. I began listening to what her experience was. And I realized that her reality could be really different from the other average reality that most people experience, but that didn't make it any less valid that it was what she experienced and it was her reality. So I began to just listen to her and not judge and not tell her what to do or how to handle things, which I have now understood that this is empathy, to just sit with someone through their feelings. And that enabled us to have this really special bond where she was able to tell me anything and to maintain this open communication. That was really important in having her have someone that she could tell anything to, any of her difficulties or concerns, so that we could act on emergency plans and make sure she had the support that she needed exactly when she needed it, and then identify any upcoming crises to try to prevent them if we could, or at least be prepared. So through that, I kind of started to see I had this skill set, and I've always been interested in psychology, and it's something that I kind of toyed with before. I just love the way the human brain works, and I love people and how people work. And my mental floss is watching reality TV shows because I just love different people's experiences. And then with the concussion, I came to see the parallels, and I understood that I had this acute mental illness, and having that repetitively, I definitely have some symptoms that I'll have to deal with long-term in mental health that I'll be able to manage, I believe, and just recognizing and understanding them. Yeah, and so I was just looking at programs to try to see if I could do a master's in counseling psychology or social work. And when I was exploring that, my counselor had told me about the peer support worker program, which was a great experience for me to have to work my way into this field and to have the experience that I would need to apply to these programs in the future.
I think that's just super fascinating and inspiring to go from being a program user to a program coordinator. That's just lovely and inspiring to all of us. And yeah, I'm thrilled for you. That's amazing. And so how long have you been running or working with the peer support program?
So I'm currently just at the tail end of finishing my practicum. You have to do 20 hours in group sessions, which I've now completed. I worked with a concussion support group through Vancouver Coastal Health, which was very fulfilling. I've had so much experience and information that I was just very happy to share with people who generally, I was in a group with people who had long-term concussion symptoms, and they were not coming through recovery very efficiently. And then the other group I had worked with was Youth Connections, which is a pilot project. We just finished our 6 sessions, and we're about to start another 6 sessions this Thursday. And that is created and supported through Zero Ceiling. So yeah, I'm just hoping to get a contract soon, and that's in the works there, so that I can continue on from practicum into employee.
Excellent. And maybe from there, the master's program as well. So my fingers are crossed for you there.
Thank you. I am definitely hoping that will happen within the next couple of years, and it's looking like I will have some opportunities to get there for sure.
Well, and you have your own cake plate, Laurel, with your own lived experience, and that solid foundation of your lived experience, which really lends itself to this field and holding space with people with empathy and compassion to, walk them on their nonlinear journey. So yeah, it's quite inspiring. Jeanette, our fearless moderator, I'm wondering if there are any questions from your side of the fence through Slido or otherwise.
Yeah, you bet. I have 1 million of my own questions, but there are also some questions in Slido, so I'll try to cover as many as we can. Before I pass along any questions, I just want to say, Laurel, that I feel like one of the themes that came out of your, the conversation that you and Greg just had is that is a theme of self-advocacy. because I heard you talk about your first medical experience with concussion treatment as being really not great, and then when you came to Whistler, it was night and day, just based on their experience with concussions in the clinic down here, and then kind of the same situation with your counseling, where your first round of counseling was not a positive experience, but now you have experienced what really great counseling can be. And to me, what that says is, if you have a feeling in your gut that you're not getting the care you deserve, you can advocate for yourself and get a second opinion or go to somebody else. And I think that alone is a really great takeaway from what you guys just talked about.
Yeah, and I might add to that. Often I'll say, good counseling is like getting a good haircut. Right when that haircut's over if you're coming back or not. And, for me, I've had a lot of good counseling, so good, in fact, that I don't have to get my haircut anymore.
Lucky you. But as for questions from the audience, so somebody is asking about the support groups that you were just talking about. And I'll be honest, I've never been to a meeting like that either. I could see that maybe somebody would be intimidated or a little nervous to attend a support group. Could you tell us a little bit about what one of those groups is actually like to attend?
Is this in reference to the Smart Recovery group, I would assume?
I'm not sure. The question just says support groups. And then it goes on to ask, is it mainly for concussion recovery or does it cover other subjects as well? So maybe that question rolled in before you got to the later part of the conversation.
Okay, yeah, I can speak to groups generally. So I did help co-facilitate the concussion group that was operated out of Squamish by Vancouver Coastal Health. I'm not super familiar with Squamish's direct programs, but that one in particular, it has been on Zoom because of COVID. And then Whistler Community Services has a different sort of concussion group. And I'm not sure what their status is on that right now with COVID. But that group is more of an information group, and you need to sign up for that in advance. If you check in with Whistler Community Services, they can help you with that. And we don't have an independent group up here in Pemberton at this time, unfortunately. But in speaking to going to groups, it definitely is intimidating. But as Greg had said before, and what Brene Brown generally speaks to, if you're familiar with her at all, is that vulnerability drives connection. So if you're going into something like that, you're absolutely going to feel very vulnerable. You're going to feel a little bit uncomfortable and unsure. You're probably going to be sharing some difficult experiences. If you're like me, I get really emotional now because of my concussions. I cry very frequently. In my peer support group, I cried almost every session at some point, but I can kind of talk through my tears. And I've just had to accept that is my new way of being, and just it is what it is. But that vulnerability and having that means ultimately you're going to connect with other people within that group. And there's nothing like it to connect with people who have gone through similar experiences. And for me in particular, the Smart Recovery group, that first session that I went to was probably one of the hardest things I've ever had to do. You can maybe tell I get emotional just speaking about it now. I felt incredibly vulnerable. It was a huge step for me to accept that I needed that help. But I pushed through that discomfort, and the entire session, I didn't quite feel like I necessarily belonged, but by the end of it, I I felt so accepted by this community with a very diverse background. They weren't all in for the same types of addictions. Everybody had their own story and their own journey, and they were in their own place. And it was just very inspiring and fulfilling to connect with them. And I discovered new tools and strengths that I didn't know that I had through those connections.
And Laurel, Smart Recovery, that's run through VCH, is that correct?
No, that they do work through Smart Recovery. They do have some programs themselves, but there's a larger body of Smart Recovery that if you go to their website, they have meetings that are within Vancouver Coastal Health Territory, but you can also join meetings outside of the area, so that say you don't want to accidentally come in contact with someone you might know, you're not ready for that, you can end up in a group with people in the States. I think it might even be international, but it is operated out of the States.
That's awesome, because I'm sure that sort of anonymity would be appealing to some people, at least to start with. But I imagine that having attended some groups like this yourself and now running them, I just think about how lucky folks will be to have you as a facilitator, because you are now willing to make yourself vulnerable. And they can see that in you, like the fact that a facilitator can show their emotions, I'm sure will put the group members at ease somewhat.
And I think a key piece with vulnerability is that, number one, it tends to work out in our favor. The research tells us that it tends to like pay off. And when it pays off, the nervous system builds a sense of empowerment, and that empowerment enables it to allow it to be a little bit more vulnerable the next time. And that's how personal growth happens.
Oh, go ahead, Laurel.
I was just going to agree, really.
I have a complete total subject change. Although I guess it isn't really, because it's still about vulnerability. I was going to ask you about your coming out process, and just hearing you speak about you kind of gave us a great summary of sort of the difference between bisexuality and pansexuality. And I don't know if you saw me do my little cheer, but I just love the idea that so pansexuality sort of releases you from the constraints of the gender binary, which is something, I'm a cis woman, but still, I don't want to have to be a certain kind of woman, I want to be whoever I am, so I think it's really exciting to hear that from you. But I know some folks listening might know about the idea of bisexual erasure, where they say, oh, nobody's really bisexual, they're just like on their way to being gay. And I'm sure with pansexuality, people probably have similar reactions to that. I'm wondering if you can speak to that at all, like, if people, how the people in your life sort of went on that journey with you.
For sure. So I actually identified as being, at the time I called it bisexual, at a really young age. It just wasn't until I was much older that I came out to my family, but I came out to my friends when I was in high school. Actually, I started to identify when I was 12. And at that time in my generation, the big new thing was chat rooms. So I was talking to people in chat rooms, and I was able to be open there with some being anonymous. And then when I went into high school, I started being open with my friends about it, but I was nervous with some of them because there's also this thing where, especially in my generation, the slang term for stupid was gay. That's so gay meant that's so stupid. And that was really frustrating and difficult, and it was shameful for me. So there were some people that I was uncomfortable coming out to because of that. And then I found this weird binary thing of it's okay to be a lesbian, it's not okay to be gay. It's okay for girls to like girls, it's not okay for guys to like guys. And trying to navigate through that was really frustrating as well. But ultimately, yeah, you do get people, I haven't experienced it too often, where they do want to polarize you into, well, you're just on your way to being a lesbian. Or there's this phenomenon I found when I was younger with unsupportive, less supportive partners, was that if I was with a guy, I was heterosexual at that time. And if I was with a woman, I was a lesbian at that time. And I really just wanted to still have my identity while being with a partner of whatever gender they were or wherever they sat on that gender spectrum. And for me, I now have a partner who is very supportive and understanding. He asks me questions. He wants to know. He has some more feminine traits and he's comfortable with that. I have more masculine traits and he's comfortable with that. And it's really great that just to be supported with someone who's willing to ask the questions and understand.
That's awesome. I think, you know, whoever's listening, you know, we often have young folks in the audience, but I think no matter who's listening, I think it's just really, it's great to hear that you found somebody like that who's excited to be on the journey with you. Because I'm sure that there are lots of people struggling with partners who are like, okay, well, it's great if you're gay, but you're something else. I don't know. You know, I don't know if I'm ready for that. So I think it's just awesome that that you're having this experience now. Now we only have a couple of minutes left, but I wanted to ask you about grief. Because you mentioned maybe a couple of times the idea of grieving over you know, whether it's an activity that you can't engage in anymore, or the fact that, you know, you might have long-term health issues due to your concussions, so you may have to grieve parts of your personality, or you may have to grieve the loss of friends. So it's not just grief is not just as straightforward as saying, oh, you know, somebody I love has passed away. So I'm wondering if you can speak to us about this kind of more broad idea of grief.
Absolutely. And I did actually find that when I was trying to get some self-help with grief, that most of the things that I came across were how to deal with the death of someone, which is a type of grief, absolutely. But what I was experiencing wasn't that at all. It was this loss of self that had happened over time in different ways with the relationship that I was in, and also the concussion, and then the loss of job and the loss of my community. And so in order to work through that, as I had said, it was sitting with it to understand it and to find a counselor or friends who would just actually listen and support. But one of the other key ingredients to handling grief is to also have gratitude. So gratitude at the same time, and to see what else in your life is good, and so for example, with my concussion recovery, I had so much loss, but I started to recognize all of these gains. I was extremely in tune with my physical body, and I started to recognize my alignment a lot more, and to appreciate my body and to be kinder to it physically, and to stop pushing it through what I used to do when I was tree planting, and the injuries that I used to really exert myself through. And I came to appreciate my mind, and I learned mindfulness techniques. I learned how to really sit and process emotions. I learned who was there for me for real in my life. Those friends who are willing to support and understand, to ask the hard questions, and to listen. And I think another thing about asking hard questions, and this also goes to things surrounding gender and sexuality identity, is that it's okay to take the risk to ask questions. Sometimes you're gonna ask the wrong thing. You know, we grow up in a society where things have been laid out a certain way, and you've been taught certain things as you grow up, and it can be hard to figure out how to ask questions comfortably. But hopefully the people who are going to answer them can understand and appreciate that you might not have the best idea of things at the time, but the key is that you want to know and you want to learn and grow. And in order to ask those hard questions, just admit your ignorance. It's okay to not know. It was very difficult for me to navigate with my partner when they were identifying as transgender. And I said a lot of the wrong things at the start. And unfortunately, they struggled to forgive that. And that was really hard for me. But that person ended up not being a healthy person in my life. And the people who have been able to forgive and understand, those are the ones that have been there. They're the strongest part of my community.
And that community piece, people are such a big part of the healing process through grief. So, you know, and so those people that rise to the top, who build that newfound community, that lifelong community, perhaps really does help with our healing with grief and loss.
I love that reminder that you can't be afraid to make mistakes and ask the wrong questions, because there's just no way to learn otherwise. If we pretend we have all the answers, we're never going to grow as people. And there's some cheesy corporate mantra that the word fail just stands for first attempt in learning. Mm-hmm. That speaks to me.
No, for sure.
Well, team, it is 9:31, so I think it is time for us to wrap up. Greg or Laurel, do you have any other last things to share with us? Laurel, if folks are wanting to join a VCH support group, where do they start?
You'd start by contacting your local community services. So Whistler Community Services, the Pemberton Medical Clinic, and then I believe the Squamish Medical Clinic. And you can also go to bch.ca. And for concussion in particular, you can go to bch.ca/concussion, and they have a really comprehensive guide on there for recovery.
Amazing. Okay, and I will be sure to add those details to the library's Litminds page, so don't feel like you have to frantically scroll those details down right now, folks. I'll make sure that you can find them on whistlerlibrary.ca after this event. And with that, I think I have to just say thank you to Greg and Laurel again. Thank you to the YC and to Luna, and of course, thank you to our sponsors, the Whistler RCMP and to VCH. And I think that's it for us. See you on August 4th.